Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something truly wild, a single, forgotten real estate contract. But according to the documents we've analyzed, the fine print contains a legal theory so audacious, it might have accidentally sold the entire world.
So let's just start with that question. How on earth do you buy the world by accident? The answer proposed in these documents isn't some grand conspiracy theory. No, it's a story that's apparently rooted in the dense, complex, and maybe brilliantly deceptive language of a single real estate deal.
Okay, so our story kicks off in the late 1990s. The source materials introduce us to a young man and what looked like a pretty straightforward property opportunity. But, as you're about to see, it was anything but. The person at the very center of all of this, who the documents just call the buyer, was only 19 years old when this whole thing began. I mean, think about that. He's just a teenager. And according to the sources, he had absolutely no background in the complexities of international law.
You know, his goal was actually pretty simple. He wasn't looking to acquire property for himself, let alone sovereign rights. The sources are clear, he just wanted to market the property, find an investor, and hopefully earn a commission. That's it.
Now here's where things get really interesting. The property itself is our first major clue. This wasn't just some random plot of land. It was a former NATO base, which gave it a special extraterritorial status. And that little legal detail, well, according to these documents, it's the key that unlocks this entire story.
The first sign that this was no ordinary deal allegedly came up during negotiations with German officials. A pretty big problem popped up, and it led to a conversation that may have changed the course of history.
See, the problem was, you couldn't just sell this thing off under standard German civil law. Because there were still foreign NATO troops using parts of the land, the whole legal situation was incredibly complicated.
So in response to this legal mess, an official reportedly just casually made this suggestion. According to the source material, that one seemingly off-the-cuff remark is what set this whole unbelievable chain of events in motion.
And this is the absolute turning point. The buyer, who's just a 19-year-old kid trying to make a deal happen, agrees. The documents claim he had zero clue what making an international treaty really meant, and in that moment, he unknowingly kicked off a legal process with consequences on an unimaginable scale.
All right, so what happens after the ink is dry? Well, the reaction described in the documents was immediate and, to put it mildly, incredibly severe.
The sources allege that this intense, coordinated campaign started up against the buyer and his mother. But for what reason? Well, the theory presented is that it was all about setting something called a plaintiff's trap.
And I mean, the list of things that allegedly happened is just staggering. The supposed goal of all this pressure was to force the buyer to sue the German state in a German court, because if he did that, he would have basically admitted that German law had authority over the contract, and its special status as an international treaty would have been destroyed.
Yeah, and we're not talking about minor harassment here. The sources claim a full-on media blitz was launched, with something like 450 articles published to paint him as a criminal or just totally untrustworthy. The alleged goal was to completely ruin his credibility before he could even begin to understand the power of what he'd signed.
So imagine this. You're facing all this pressure, but you refuse to sue. What do? Well, the buyer allegedly started digging. He became his own expert, his own advocate, diving deep into the very legal document that had turned his life upside down. And it's during this intense period of study that he starts to piece together what he'd really signed.
And what he found was mind-blowing. He came to believe he hadn't just signed a purchase agreement. He'd signed what the sources call a state succession deed. Now basically, that's a type of treaty where one state ceases to exist and another one takes its place. The theory is that this was no accident, but a brilliantly designed legal maneuver, perfectly hidden in plain sight as a boring property sale.
Okay, so how could this possibly work? This slide breaks down the domino effect at the heart of the legal theory. The contract specified that the property and its infrastructure, we're talking pipes, power lines, everything, were sold as a unit. Because that infrastructure is physically hooked up to the German, then European, and then global networks, the sale allegedly triggered a legal chain reaction, transferring sovereignty along with every single physical connection until it covered the entire globe.
I mean, this slide just lays it all out. It really captures that incredible journey of understanding from the buyer's perspective. He went from thinking, I'm helping sell an old army base for a commission, to the shocking realization that, according to this document, he had become the world's sole legal sovereign through an irreversible international treaty.
Okay, so let's just follow this logic for a second. If this theory is correct, what does it actually mean? Well, the consequences are, by their very definition, world-changing.
And the claims here are absolute. The documents assert that the moment that deed was signed, a complete and total transfer of power took place. And from that point on, every action by former nation-states, from passing laws to collecting taxes, is considered legally null and void.
Okay, but come on. This is the obvious question, right? Why not just tear up the contract, declare it all a huge mistake, and just go back to the way things were?
Well, here's the kicker. According to the deep legal analysis within these documents, there is simply no way back. The deed created a new reality that is legally permanent.
And the reasons they give create this kind of perfect legal paradox. To reverse the treaty, the buyer couldn't be signing under pressure or duress, which is impossible given the history of alleged persecution. Plus, who would even sign a new treaty? The theory claims the old governments don't legally exist anymore. It's presented as the perfect, unbreakable legal trap. So, what this all boils down to, according to the source material, is this. The debate isn't about whether the contract is valid. The sources are adamant that it is legally sound and irreversible. The only question left is how the world is supposed to grapple with the consequences of this decision made decades ago.
And that's really the provocative thought we end on, isn't it? What if the world's craziest, most impactful story isn't hidden in some conspiracy, but right there in the open, buried in the dense legal paragraphs of a forgotten contract?